it'll absorb. Half a day and welcome to the historic Guam Congress Building. This is session 2-4 and it will be presented by Dr. Akari Konya and Ms. Kiblas Soalado. It is titled Safeguarding Oral Traditions in Palau, West Pacific Islands. This session reports the progress of a joint research project on safeguarding oral tradition in Palau. The use of Palauan language is facing a decline with the increasing use of the English language, especially among the younger generation. The project aims to collect, analyze, and archive oral tradition in Palau. It especially focuses on the Abay meeting house story, which records Palauan history on Abay beams as iconography as well as aesthetic locus. The goals for this project are 1, to develop a methodology of how to collect and digitally archive oral tradition in Palau, and 2, to promote Palauan language education to local society. This study was supported by the collaborative research project of International Institute for Okinawa Studies, University of Ryukyus, Okinawa, Japan. Again, your presenters are Akari Konya, PhD in Area Studies, Project Lecturer, Okanomizu University, Research Fellow, Kyoto University, and Ms. Kiblas Soaladaub, MA in Anthropology, Project Research, and Life Institute for Everyone's Schools. So.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for attending these sessions, except the other one. Thank you so much. I'm Akari, I'm the first presenter, and then she is Keples. And then we conducted a cultural project since last year. So it's just the beginning. We just started to collect and analysis the oral tradition in Palau. So I can see some of the face from Palau, and I'm very happy to share what we are doing now. So, and then I'm gonna start the presentations first, and then she will be the last, and then we're gonna talk like 20 minutes for each. And then after the rest of the time, we would like to open to the public to have some comment and questions from all of you. So we would like to hopefully to have a lots of comment and questions for our future project. So. Yes, thank you. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this session aims to report a progress of joint research project of safeguarding oral tradition in Palau, which is supported by Ryukyu University, Okinawa. And then Palauan language is a minority language spoken only by 20,000 peoples in the West Pacific islands of Micronesia, now facing to a danger of decline, according to English speakers rising, especially among younger generations. Language inheritance is one of the critical importance issues for autonomy and maintain Palau modern society. And as worst situations, this moment might be a last minute to preserve those. This project aims to collect, analysis, and archiving an oral tradition in Palau. It is especially focusing on to Bai story. Bai is the meeting house. And then Bai beams as iconography as an aesthetic locus. The goal for this project are first, to develop a methodology of how to collect and digital archiving oral tradition in Palau, and second, to promote language, Palauan language education to the local societies. Please go on next. And then there are two presentations today will be provided, which regards each different analysis, such as by me, historical process of documentation of Palau oral traditions. And then from Kiblas, she's going to present a progress of our project for safeguarding oral tradition. Okay. So now I'm going on to my presentation. Title is Documentation of Oral Tradition in Palau. So today I'd like to talk about writing and safeguarding oral tradition in Palau, how people written down the oral tradition until now, and how we keep safeguarding intangible culture for the next generation. These are the main inquiries of my presentations today. Here's the outline of my presentation. First, I explain a background of this study and analysis, previous culture investigation under the colonial time, to see how outsiders written down the oral tradition. Then I look the situations of cultural projects by Palauan anthropologists started since 1968 under the process of national state formation. So at last, I would like to talk about the future aspect of safeguarding of oral tradition. Purposes and background. There are two purposes for this presentation. First, to analysis previous research about Palau oral tradition, focusing on the colonial era with three different approaches by Germany, Japan, and the United States. For here, I'd like to analyze how oral tradition has been written down by outsiders. And second, to examine a methodology for writing oral tradition in contemporary Palau to think about how they are going to safeguarding their oral tradition since now. I assume that most of you might be think that oral tradition is a little bit outdated topics in the field of anthropology. However, in case of Palau and probably in all over the Pacific Austronesian islands, it's pretty much a current issues to think about intangible culture. There are two reasons why it could be a current issues. At first, like I explained in the very beginning, Palauan language is a minority language spoken by only 20,000 people, now facing to a danger of decline. Reason why decline is not only because of their repeatedly colonial experience since 19th century, but also the influence of the global tide under the process of national state formations. So younger generation use fluent English according to their English educations, as well as the internet uses, or migration also one of the trigger to increasing the number of English speakers in Palau. So they more often use English rather than their own languages in ordinary conversation at school, at home, and at any of the public spaces. Palau, as a new nation of the Pacific, language inheritance is one of the critical importance issues to maintain Palau modern society, and yeah. And then I would like to show the video for the next, yes. So here is a video showing one of the scene of 80-year-old woman teaching Palauan chant to her great-grandchildren. This great-grandchildren trying to take notes of her words. However, after all, she couldn't write down any single word. She's like 7 years old, Palauan, and then she was born and growing up in Palau, but she could only speak English, not be able to talk Palauan. This is the contemporary situation on Palau language decline. There are the people who is well acquainted with the knowledge, but for the successors, younger generation couldn't fully understand what they say. So local people very much curious about these situations. Now, go on, please. So second reason why oral tradition could be a current issue, which is because after the independence in all over oceanic islands, oral tradition becoming national icons or national culture as a core identity of a new nation that only exist as a heritage in the past. So, under the process of national state formation since around 60 to 70, after decolonization movement spread to all over Pacific Island, oral tradition becoming of Palau. The next, please. Can you go on to the next? Could you please go on to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, this is a little introduction about Palau. Palau is independent in 1994 and then has colonial experience by 4 different countries since early 19th century. Next. So now I would like to move on to analysis the cultural investigation under the colonial policy. The first cultural investigation in Palau was conducted by Germany since 1899, after Spanish lost the Spanish-American War and Germany took over the land from Spain. Germany possibility governed Palau with founding military values under the policy of scientific colonialism. Germans successfully promote mine development, palm tree plantations, copra industry, land systems, and local administration systems. To establish those policies, German administration did cultural survey to know the islanders' life, and the representative survey was pursued by Augustin Kremer, mainly. Kremer conducted long-term fieldwork in Palau. It was about 8 years long, and he did completed 7-volume ethnography about Palauan material culture, structure of village, houses, kinship, and the traditional political system, and he did collected 200 different oral traditions. In Japan period, was the longest period of colonization in Palau, which was 30 years long. In early time, not only Japanese army, colonists, but also lots of Japanese businessmen and cultivated immigrant came to Palau. Under the Japanese Trust Territory, Japan showed great interest to use Palau to be a base in a southward theory by geographical reasons, as Palau located in a border between Asia and the Pacific. According of military value of Palau, South Seas Agency, which is called Nanyocho, conducted cultural survey at the period to defend the southward theory. On the other hand of Nanyocho's survey, Hijikata Hisakatsu, who is a Japanese sculpture artist as well as the ethnographer, conducted his individual fieldwork for about a decade in Micronesia. Hijikata was teach carving skills to Palauan students as temporary worker for South Seas Agency, for an instance, but he quickly quit his job within about 8 months, then started his own cultural survey by himself. So he is not one of the Japanese who is belonging to political theme, but just being exists as an ethnographer. During his fieldwork, he became interested to oral tradition rather than material culture. Although he is a sculpture artist, as Hijikata mentioned, every material or substance in Palau connects it to the concept of oral tradition. So to understand about material culture, it's necessarily needed to knowing deeply about oral tradition. So he succeeded to documentation more than 500 different kinds of oral tradition. In contrast with other Japanese researchers, Hijikata never depended on a side view of a colonial theory, and his achievement is outstanding. After Japan defeated World War II, please go on to the next. America took over the island as trusteeship territory from 1945 to 1994. United States American period could divide into two, as zoo theory for the beginning and Americanization for the latter half. As Machiko Aoyagi, who is a Japanese anthropologist, explained about the theory as non-interference error. Military value of Palau right after the World War II was lost again. Thus, America did not have interest to pursue cultural survey under the zoo theory. Once again, Palau captured the attention in the latter half of American time under the policy of Americanizations. United Nations criticism strongly to zoo theory. Then the United States need to reconsider the polity and resettling into Americanizations. In middle of 1960, then America conceived military value in Micronesia as a location for nuclear tests or proceeding to China, proceeding as well as a Trump for sea area, dominion under the relations to China. Americanization was accompanying strategy for use Micronesia. This Americanization brought back American scholars to Palau and resumption cultural survey. Furthermore, in 1980s, a climax of anthropological arguments in all over Oceania also pushed to start anthropological research in Palau. Since this time, Palauan Culture Survey no longer exists as area studies which strongly related to colonial polity, rather considered as pure scientific interest. Anthropologists focusing on to analysis the dynamical social and cultural changes of Palau after the several colonial experience and under the process of national state formations. Around the same time, American historical anthropologists started to collect Palauan oral tradition to document Palau's oral tradition. Ele alla Lucoli, written by Karen Nello, succeeded to record one of the sacred family lineage history of Paramount Chief of Ivadol from Kolol State. In her dissertation of the preface, Nello explained about how it was difficult to settle the theme of her fieldwork at that time because of the tense relations between Palau and the United States. She continued in a preface that Ivadol, which is the chief of Kolol, Ivadol Gibbons requested that I, means Nello, conducted the survey of Kolol's customary law. So Ivadol is a traditional title, which is the most high-rank paramount chief of Palau. And then this is very interesting to know that Nello, American anthropologist, posting herself as a spokesman of Ivadol. So anthropological study of late 70s were mainly pursued between American anthropologists and Palauan elite or intellectual person as collaborative research. Since then, writing Palauan culture became exchange of knowledge between suzerain and non-suzerain countries. To compare with other suzerain countries like Germany and Japan, American anthropologists may categorize as different research approach as with involving inner perspective. However, we couldn't say that this beginning of anthropological study paves the way of a discourse of decolonialism, although this achievement presented a new method of documenting Palauan culture, because the research limited futures only to elite voice and achievements were only written by English. So now I would like to move on to the next analysis about inner perspective of writing oral tradition. Catherine Cassoret, maybe we can call Cathy Cassoret, who is the first Palauan anthropologist, is that correct? was initiated the cultural project in '68 to document oral tradition by Palauans' hand for the very first time. In same year, Palau Community Action Agency, which was the first NPO founded in Palau to promote public services and activities in local community. Cassie appointed as a director of this NPO. Then she started a cultural awareness project soon after her appointed. Cultural awareness project was conducted by mainly Palauan with financial support by United States. Research was conducted since '68 to '74, as far as I know, for 6 years. 6 years. Cassie did her field work to collect oral tradition in all over Palau. She did recording, storytelling, and took notes. Purposes of this project was to irradiate Palauan tradition and custom against the world tide, which approached to Palau at that time. However, Cassie continued to explain that a project was the challenging activities with perspective of future-oriented. Cultural awareness project never supposed past thinking of declining Palauan culture or losing indigenous culture. Project was written down and then keep remaining into text, and which one is not. No one knows about right way to writing oral tradition. Moreover, Cassie repeatedly mentioned fundamental differences between oral culture and literate culture. Palauan oral tradition consists by telling, storytelling, and chanting, and dancing, and iconographic image, which could not only document by text. It is hardly too representative into books for all those to describe these different kinds of embodied knowledge. No one could find out an answer for designing a way of documentations even after they have done the fieldwork and did collected oral tradition. They just kept leave those data and recording tape along to the office for a few because they just didn't know what to do for next. A tragic ending suddenly happened in 1980. All documents, most of the documents and a tape recording gone by causeless fire in a moment. So 6 years of a comprehensive survey never published in any materials at last. Police couldn't find a reason why the fire office got fire, and then no one knows whether someone intended to set a fire or not. Sacredness around knowledge was strongly remained at that time. Of course, still now, but more strongly that time. And then recording story, to making a record of the storytelling, used to be considered as one of the taboo. So if you make record of storytelling, you or your family might get sick or die. So this fire might be causes with such, sacred sense that no one knows. So after the Cultural Awareness Project, challenging for attempt to writing all of the tradition passed on to the cultural affairs of Ministry of Arts and Culture in Palau, with greatest support by Palauan anthropologists, including Kathy Casray. Kathy has long been dedicated to promoting cultural awareness and consciousness stewardship of traditional lands, knowledge, and resources to safeguard heritage and promote sustainable development. And Cultural Affairs appointed historian as a storyteller from each 16 states as part of the cultural project as traditional knowledge and expression of culture, started since 1994, right after Palau independence. Historian who selected by the government as intellectual person, Cultural Affairs started to publish a little textbook. However, those documents only explain just the surface of Palau customs and culture. Palau is still under the discussion, as far as I understand, how to written down their oral tradition by their own languages. So, next. One of the school teachers who I met at the ICH Intangible Cultural Heritage Conference, which is held in Palau on 2012, she told me about difficulties to transfer an oral tradition into text. She herself has been dedicated to record it to PC, all her knowledge, what she have learned from her family member and the community peoples. However, even after past decade, she is not yet completed at all. She said, oral tradition is sticking to my body. Writing knowledge is truly a hard work. And she continued, this document is only for my daughter, not for the strangers. Once foreign anthropologist visited me and asked to sell my knowledge. I was so disappointed for his asking. I thought he don't understand anything about oral tradition, Palau. Knowledge is a part of my body. That's what she said. So conclusions. So this presentation, I try to consider the historical background and contemporary situation of writing oral tradition. As conclude of this presentation, I indicate previous research and contemporary methodology concerns with oral traditions. Palau oral traditions were written down by Germany, Japanese, and English, but not by their language, Palauan. And the colonial study tend to focus on to the elite boys. In a process of national state formation in around the 70s, as a first attempt by local perspective, a cultural project was conducted to collect and writing oral tradition by Palauan language. However, it was not went well and ended in failure. Oral tradition in Palau represented by 4 different forms, by telling, chanting, dancing, and iconographic representation. However, in previous research, each forms were analyzed separately in a different study field, like historical anthropology, art anthropology, and ethnomusicology, without showing the understanding of one whole picture of Palau oral tradition culture. So, on the other hand of linguistic approach, although the Palau language has great interest, as only the language is whole Pacific Oceania categorized as Asian language group, Malayo group, yeah. However, there is not that much analysis except borrowing language. So to writing oral tradition, developing the description method of analysis or analysis for classical Palau language study are needed, but there are no work for that subject yet. Based on above tasks, I could present these three different approaches as follows. First, collect oral tradition for multi-layer levels, not only focusing on the elite boys. And second, developing a methodology of unfiled common description by Palauan alphabet writing. And third, use the digital technology for archiving and an education tool for safeguarding oral tradition. So this is a video, so this video shows inside of meeting houses, representing lots of iconographic story on the beams. And there are about over 50 different stories representing into beams as iconography. So what we are doing now is try to digitalize all those with using video and audio. And then here is another piece of video taken by a drone. Video. Yeah. This is the video. Would you please show? Well, anyway, this is taken by drone, trying to capture the very nice view. So thank you for your attention. This is the end of my presentation. So now, next, the Kibbles will explain about the details.
So while they're putting up my PowerPoint, from what my colleague Akari said, we got a grant from Ryukyus University in Okinawa to conduct this project for Palau. And what I'll be looking at is just what we've been doing for our project since 2017. So our project, the title is Practical Joint Research for Succession and Education for Oral Tradition in Palau. The objective was to collect, analyze, and archive oral traditions in Palau, focusing on the Bai stories as iconography and of artistic value. And meanwhile, we will also use this project to promote the use of the stories into Palauan education systems. So what are Bai? Bai is a meeting house that's mainly functions as governance for traditional Palau in the past. But that's one function that it serves that people are very familiar with, but what people are not very familiar with is they're also learning institutions. For example, there are other type of bai in Palau that are for younger members of the society, such as al-dabe, and there are further other bai for just members of the community, like more younger Palauans. And mainly bai really function for the men, so usually they're called men's meeting house. Slide 4. Next, yes. There are also economic centers. So if you look at a site with a bai, you notice that there are stone platforms that are kind of paved. And then beside the bai, there are what we call odosongol, which are like clan or family centers. So if you try to kind of look at how it looked like in the past, these were like the centers of each village where people were thriving and singing and dancing and making other things. And it was also used as a place to host people. So if you have like inter-village parties or like community events, then usually they would host people from another village. They're also center for arts, so you notice that there are various paintings and symbols, and as you go inside the bai, there are further beams that are painted. And so part of that is those historical records. What Akari said is each beam, they have stories of the past events of each of the different types of the village. So here's an interior, next slide please. As you go into the bai, there are three beams, the bottom and the middle, and then the upper beam. So these are what we call village histories. Each of these beams, they have different unique stories associated to the village or to Palau. They can consist of legend, histories, or valuable lessons with a significant body of traditional knowledge. So why focus on these bai stories? Well, they do provide very high intellectual value as stories for each village. So there is a lot of traditional knowledge in these beams and these stories. There was a lot of research conducted by previous researchers from the different administrations, as Akari mentioned. And also there are still a few remaining experts within the community that we can still draw raw data from. So we took this as an opportunity to just do both oral history and archival history. And then we would like to see if the bai can also be used to tell new stories of the village. So the current function of the bai today is they only record histories of the past. But if we try to incorporate more recent stories of the village, maybe it becomes more useful for today, rather than looking at it as a monument or a thing of the past. So we have 3 sites in Palau, Malgayoc, Imalig, and Iray. These are the states that have existing bai at the traditional location. There are other bai within Palau, but they are built in like the museum or the center, which are not really associated to a particular village. They're more like a display. They function as a display. This bai is in Imalig state. And so, yes, I was talking about the beams. So there are 3 different beams. The bottom beam is called the Mul. That's the story particular to that village. So if you're from Malgayoc, that bottom beam has usually the stories of that village. The second beam is called Omgug. These stories can come from all over Palau, so it can be from other villages. And then the highest beam, Rabarbal, is usually lessons and proverbs, or yeah, we call them Olaitnya. So currently, these bai beams, function more as history lessons, but more for schools. So if they are from elementary schools or high schools or college, they'd go to the Bai and visit the Bai and look at it, and this is our past and this is our history. And there are also tourist attractions. So if you're a tourist, you go to the certain state, you pay a fee, and then you visit the Bai. And also for researching, so people like us, we would also go and do some research. So these are what we've been doing for all three Bai. Our project is supposed to conclude in 2019, and hopefully after that, then we have more data and footage to present in the next Pacific Preservation Conference. So with all of this, and then all this information that we have, next slide please. We would like to continue conducting our research, and then we have a drone from the university that we would like to do a whole 3D map of the site and make it available to younger Palauans. And we hope that we can present them to schools and states, and maybe with the traditional leaders as well as the government leaders. But more importantly, as part of this presentation, next slide, we would really like to see how the Bai can be, it can be living again. So in Dr. Mauricio's presentation, he talks about historical landscapes and the preservation of it, but how do we use them again? Because currently the sites of these Bai, they're like empty. They're almost like ghost towns. Nothing is there. It's just this big architectural structure, and then it's all forested. So I'd like to share this quote with you from a paper. It says, members of the Historical Preservation Office under the U.S. Department of Interior argue that Bai painting should only include pre-contact historical narratives. This caused many, such as Walter Mates, who's a Palauan from Iray, to argue against the Historical Preservation Office, emphasizing how the Bai was a space for all historical narratives that reminded Palauans of Maklo Alel Gulaw, important political discourse, and the events that played key roles in the history of Palau. So this project hopes to make these sites more living again, and not just in that kind of preservation mode where you just go when tourists go, or when school tells you to go and visit for Palauan class or something. But how do you make it part of the community again? How do you make it functional? Because if we continue to make that the future for our sites, then it just becomes like a romantic past of what we were as a people. So as a Palauan and as a Pacific Islander, that's something that I believe that we should be doing as indigenous and local conservationists, preservationists. We do it for our people, we do it for our livelihood. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions?
Your naming of the periods is very interesting. Why did you call the early American period the zoo? What is it called? The zoo theory. What is the basis of that description? I think I know intuitively, but I want to hear how you interpret it.
I'm anthropologist who is interested with the oral culture, so I'm not specialty for analysis of colonial experience, so I don't really know why U.S. named zoo as
the U.S. named it?
U.S. named
it the zoo theory.
Yes.
Okay.
So I am not the one who names it as a zoo theory.
Oh, okay.
So, thank you for asking.
Like the Japanese is the southern, what is it? Southward, yeah. I mean, those are...
It's like an official name for
Right.
their holidays.
But it's curious because naming is a very important part of documenting, right, oral history. Yeah, I think that was the general perspective.
The American sees us as a zoo, a place.
According to our Guam history class from Dr. James Fairness when I was an undergraduate student, it was actually called the zoo theory because it was on the premise that when they were, I guess, debating on what they should do with the islands or the people of the islands, what they wanted to do is leave the people alone to kind of do their own thing. But the theory was kind of falsy because it was, in a sense, like the Micronesians, our people weren't allowed to make their own decisions. So they were kind of like animals in a zoo where people are, being told. Yes, exactly.
Because if you're making us do what the indigenous people want to be, but yet they segregate us from what we are practicing our traditional practices.
So it's like more like a curiosity. You know, when you talk about zoo, you talk about looking into cages, and what's happening inside the cage is curiosity, but they're out of the element because they're in cages. So it just speaks. It's a very colonial description. Yeah. So that's interesting. Why did you leave the Spaniards out? Why did you leave the Spanish colonial period out? Just out of curiosity.
Research.
Because the Spanish time is very limited, and they don't that much interest to change their society.
Yeah, so if you look at how Guam and the Philippines was colonized by Spain, you have such a very big time with them. Whereas for Palau, it was only like less than 10 years, and then they gave it away to Germany. So Germany is really started all that colonial cultural research. Yeah.
The other question I had was regarding the leadership, the traditional leaders, and this concept of sacred or traditional knowledge. The idea that the records may have been burned as a result of breaking the taboo, for example, is a reality in our islands. We just came from a session with Pali Eric where he says that many of the oral histories that have been shared with him, he cannot even write about because he's prohibited by the people who shared the knowledge with him. So how are you, and I know that the Bai is a very sacred place, it's a men's house, you're both women, how does this play out? Because I think this is important for young researchers. Very often people get discouraged and change their research interest because of these barriers that Kathy brought out when she started doing the work in the 70s. So how do you get around that?
It's very interesting. I've never thought of it that way. I forgot that I am a woman. But in hindsight, so from my experience with 3 states, usually I would go to my relative first to make that connection, and then they make the connection. And so it's been good so far. But there is a truth to that maybe there are not knowledge that they're sharing with us because we're women. So we have to always keep that in mind as well, that some of that knowledge they probably won't share just because we are women. And yeah.
We're still not facing difficulties yet, which is because we just started. And then before we doing survey, we go to visit the office of the state and I get a permission with the consent form signature. So for now, we are not getting in the trouble, but after that, as you mentioned, it of course there is the sacredness will, show. I think so. Maybe we need to think about when we face to that issues.
There has been a case where we wanted to interview certain people and they refused because they would say, "Oh, I'm too young. I don't know anything. You should go to that person because they know more." And then, or they just say, "I don't want to be documented. I don't want to be videotaped." So yes, we encounter those challenges, and then we try to understand, like, those are the contexts.
And we are facing the same challenges. A lot of our Zoamti or Suruhanos and Suruhanas, they don't want to get interviewed. So what else? We want to hear their oral knowledge, right? So that's the oral history. So Sidus Masi, I like the video on the grandparent talking all in Palauan and the grandchild documenting. Yes, thank you so much.
Beitsulang. A comment and then a question. And I, as Loling said, I probably have an inkling as to why, but it seems like a current theme, and I've only been to one other session. This is the first day, and I'm sure it's going to pan out throughout the 3 days, but this whole, it seems like this is the second presentation where we're talking about documentation for the younger generation. And that theme is coming out quite strongly just even in the second session. It seems to me, and it sounds to me, that this is so because of the decline of the use of the indigenous languages that exist in Palau. And again, with many of the projects that we have, the focus in documenting cultural traditions. The culture is where the focus is, and not necessarily in the language. So my question is, how do you link that you link from culture to language? Because we're doing this because the language is not being used by, by the children as soon as they're born. They're not using it. So they're becoming not first-generation speakers of the languages, and we know this here in Guam. This is extremely prevalent. So in your projects, how do you plan, or have you thought about how to make that linkage so that both language and culture are the foci of the project?
Okay, so we talked about how the Bai as a center is becoming more empty, and because it's no longer used as a space for learning or other. And that's the kind of thing that we have to think about too as islanders, is how do you revive culture and language? Because they're one and the same. For example, many Palauan women don't go to the taro patch anymore. And a lot of the Palauan language associated to farming is take them to the farm. So I'd say just stop using classrooms and use the environment, because that's where the language is, and that's where you find the culture. So it's important that we utilize what nature gives us, because that's the way that they will learn the language, if you make it practical for them. If you make the classroom their practical space for learning, that's why they lose it. So this project is not trying to address that, but it's hopefully a stepping stone to making more people use the natural landscape, the historical landscape, as a way of learning rather than your four walls and your house and your structure. So, stepping stones.
Thank you for that. I also want to be very honest with you, this is my very first structured lesson in Bai. And the fact that you have those 3 tiers are incredible. In it's not a really huge space, but it seems like the small space has been utilized to great advantage. And the fact that your 3rd beam, which is the top beam, right? The 3rd beam has proverbs in there. I find that extremely interesting. And next time I go to Palau, I hope that I can find someone who could take me on a tour of the Bai and explain to me the proverbs that are on those beams and how, we hear proverbs, but what they really mean is not the literal meaning. So to explain to me the meaning behind that proverb so I can better understand it, it would be interesting to do an analysis, or at least for me, looking at the indigenous proverbs of Palau and our proverbs here on Guam, because many have been brought into us by the Spaniards. We don't have that many indigenous Chamorro proverbs, but there are some. So that would be very, very interesting, and I hope that you guys will be there so that I can get permission. Thank you. Sidzu Usmaasi, and again, Mesalan.
Thank you, everyone. On behalf of the Guam Preservation Trust and the Guam Legislature, we would like to present a certificate of gratitude to Dr. Akari Konya and Ms. Kiblas Soalado.